Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, coming at you for more podcasting awesomeness. This week, brought to you on iHeartRadio, I believe. Our podcast is out there, as well as on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and many other platforms. Also on YouTube here with video. Okay, guys, this week we are doing another Rock'em Sock'em video with one of our favorite guests, Jon Atack. Hi, Jon.
Hi, Chris. Good to see you again.
Good to see you. Now, this week, we've been putting this together for a while now. We thought we would actually do the deal, do the life story, do the Jon Atack story. Because Jon Atack is amazing, as all of you guys out there know, at telling stories about things, but we've only covered bits and pieces here and there of his story. So it's time to rectify that situation once and for all. And so, Jon, are you ready?
I believe I am.
Excellent. Okay, let's do this thing. Now, for those of you who don't know, by the way, I want to put this plug in right away, which is that Jon has a fairly new and growing YouTube channel. And you guys need to check it out because Jon's putting content up there that is quite good. Very, very good. Very educational. Scientology stuff, culty stuff, influence stuff, propaganda stuff. A lot of wide range of content. Like my channel, I find Jon's content in many ways to be very inspiring for my own work. And so I want to definitely always put a plug in there that you guys go check out his stuff and hit that subscribe button because it's worth it. I think you guys are going to really like the stuff that's there and the future content. So that all being said, Jon, let's talk about your story. Where and when did it start for you?
Well, it was many lifetimes ago. This time round, and I only believe in this time round anymore, I was born in the heart of England, in Lichfield in Staffordshire, in 1955. And if anybody wants to send me a birthday card, it's the 5th of June. And I grew up there, sort of, mainly. And, I had many adventures along the way. At the age of 19, I'm a high school dropout. People accuse me of having, a vast education. I don't.
You dropped out of high school?
Yeah, I was 17 and I dropped out, yeah.
Okay, first surprise for me. I did not know that. Why abandon ship? Especially 17, you're almost done, right?
Yeah, nobody had recognized that I have what's now called delayed sleep-wake disorder, which means that my body clocks are all set, and it's very common. It's only in the last couple of years it's been realized that maybe 20% of people around the world have this, but everybody's, because we're night people, and it's the evil things that go on in the night. But I normally sleep from 4 a.m. till noon. As of course did L. Ron Hubbard, as of course does David Miscavige, so there is a bit of a trend of darkness here. There are many writers, many people have this, but it's considered socially unacceptable. And so people force themselves to live a lifestyle where they're actually not awake, and their brainwaves are in the wrong pattern. They're in the theta pattern instead of the alpha or beta pattern. Their heart rate will be wrong, their body temperature, and they'll feel miserable and horrible. But I didn't know that was going on. It started when I was 11. And by the time I was 17, I just could not get up in the morning to go to school. And so I was expected to go to Oxford or Cambridge and do really well. And I just walked away. I just sort of had enough of this. And nobody really recognized it. I've kept fighting with it for several years. And it was actually only after I got in Scientology that I got selfish enough to go, I'm just going to sleep when I feel like sleeping. And all of the pain, many of the things associated with it went away. But that was why I dropped out of school. Also, I was studying things. I was doing maths and statistics, because from the age of 16 in UK schools, you specialise. And the the statistics didn't fit with the maths part, so we didn't really know what was going on. I was doing economics, which is not actually a subject. It's a series of bizarre statements about humanity that pretends to be a science. And the art teacher had told me at the first lesson that I shouldn't have had the place, that Susan Threlfall should have had the place I'd got. And I guess I'm the only one probably the only person he ever taught in that school who actually went on to become a professional artist. But, what are you going to say? I failed my English exams and became a writer. It's just that way sometimes.
Yeah, funny. You and Hubbard both had similar things to say about higher education in some ways.
Well, and I'd say worse things than he said. I think that we are seeing a lot of cloning happening. We're seeing a lot of people who go through a great deal of education and lose themselves, in the institution, their individuality, their ability to research. Because in the last 36 years since I left Scientology, I've had a lot to do with academics and scholars. And I had Martin Poulter, who's now a professor at Bristol. When he was doing his master's degree, he said the nicest thing to me. He had a first degree from Oxford, I think, or from Cambridge, and the UK Ivy League. And he said that I did better reference notes than any of his professors, his dons. So I used to feel very intimidated by such people. I've now met so many and there are some who are the most inspiring and wonderful people, but there are an awful lot of people who are just treading water and not really producing anything, not making good, so you get somebody like, say, Steve Kent, who is a phenomenal scholar. He's really precise. He's, really digs into things, but he is the exception, not the rule. And you're lucky if you get to study with him. My friends, Rod and Linda Dubrow-Marshall up at Salford, are doing a great master's course in coercive control. But a lot of it's just pretty pedestrian. And I think I keep hearing the expression jumping through hoops. With my own kids, I'm told they've got to take these exams because once you've jumped through the hoops, you'll eventually be able to get some kind of education. So my 17-year-old will finish his high school, his advanced levels, as we call them, near A levels. And then he's going to have a gap year to study with me because the psychology and the sociology that he's doing are massively out of date. That's what's being taught. They're still teaching people about Freud in psychology as if he had some tremendous relevance. And historically, he does. Practically, he doesn't, almost outside of transference. It's about the only idea from the whole thing that survives, I think. But he wants to take time off school so he can get an education. And I think that is, so I would hold to that criticism. On the other hand, unlike L. Ron Hubbard, I don't offer doctorates for 6 weeks of sitting and listening to me. Not yet, anyway.
Exactly. And of course, I mean things like that tongue in cheek. But at the same time, I have to agree with you because I have met my share of academics and studied enough academia now, at least on these topics that we talk about, psychology, sociology, even neurology a little bit at this point. And yeah, I have had my illusions shattered about all my illusions about the sanctity or reverence with which we should approach academic institutions. They build them like these little castles and stuff, and I don't know, maybe at one point they were castles, but at least in England. But I doubt all the gloss is off the coat, because I've seen behind the curtain and I've seen what some of these folks have to say. And unfortunately, you're right. There are great academics out there. We hear from some of them. We read some of them. But, there's an awful lot of just junk that you have to wade through to get to some of that. And just because it sounds, this is my thing, is, just because somebody can write or speak or enunciate in perfect English with all these academic terms and all these highfalutin ideas kind of thing, right? I don't mean to approach this like an Appalachian, but these like kind of these big ideas expressed with really big words that are their own layer of protection against criticism. I feel that we lose something in that. And I think that, making it so inaccessible, making it so hard to access. I understand that you want to speak precisely about certain concepts, but let's be clear, some of these papers are written very definitely with arrogance first, not an effort to impart information. And that I've seen enough of that to know that people are just people, and whether they got an education or not doesn't change the person they are, or the fact that they can be manipulated or controlled just like anybody else.
Oh, very much so. And you and I have both been through the work of Gordon Melton, of James Lewis, and the lack of study, that I will find. I mean, for example, I've got to put out a piece about Hubbard and the occult the other week, and I think proved absolutely conclusively not only that he was involved with Jack Parsons and Aleister Crowley's sex magic, but that he was utterly committed to it, and that it runs all the way through Scientology. Now, in James Lewis's perverse book published by the Oxford University Press, which you have analysed elsewhere, so I don't have to, which is great. But there's this statement that, some German academics, and Fritz Haak was probably the first of them, he wrote a book called Scientology 20th Century Magic, that they put forward the view that Scientology is a magical system. And here you have Lewis's friends sort of going, no, that's absolute nonsense. Although he was involved in magic, there is nothing in Scientology that's to do with magic. David Barrett has written this. There's nothing. And you go, well, hang on a minute, you're making people into superhumans with magical powers, and there's nothing to do with magic there. You're saying you'll be able to make things appear and disappear, and it's not to do with magic. Worse than that, of course, and again, plugging my own work, but in Hubbard and the Occult, I looked at the extent to which Scientology itself could be considered to be a magical ritual. And while the people involved in it have no idea, because as Hubbard said, you have the guy who makes the games, and he doesn't have to follow the rules, and you have the player, and he has to follow the rules, and then you have to the pieces, and the player has to keep the rules hidden from the pieces. And so for me, David Miscavige is a player. I don't think he has any clue what he's actually doing. I don't think he understands what Hubbard was about at all, because he spent almost no time with Hubbard. He worked with him on the film crew briefly, but he was not an intimate of Hubbard's at any point. So I don't think he understands the Crowley background, but he knows how to keep the rules hidden, from the pieces.
Exactly. Good analogy there.
But, I find that my work is often just dismissed. James Lewis, there are 2 references to me in the whole book, in one of which my name is misspelled. In the other, the author says, well, the Scientologists are very worried about the OT3 material being exposed. So I'm just going to quote this thing that Jon Atack said. And it's a quick description that I wrote for the internet. It's not, a published paper or anything. And at the end, it says, humbly tendered as a gift to mankind. And he doesn't explain, and he perhaps doesn't know, that I'm making a sarcastic comment that this is an L. Ron Hubbard line that was used when he produced OT3. So the reader gets the wrong idea. But they won't go to my reference notes. They won't read me because I'm an ex-member. And for some reason, if you used to belong to a group, you have no rights to talk about it anymore, and your information is inevitably wrong, which is the most stupid presumption. It comes from the sociologist Brian Wilson. It was repeated by Gordon Melton. But if they go to, let's sell these people a piece of blue sky, there are over 1,100 reference notes that they could check, and they would find out, as you've pointed out with Lewis's books, they are making the most terrible mistakes because they just take what Scientology gives to them and repeat it and cash the check, and that's modern scholarship, So awful. Like when Lewis went to Japan and announced that Aum Shinrikyo couldn't possibly have killed the people in the subway, the 13 people who died. And then 2 days later, of course, they found enough sarin gas to kill 4 million people being held by Aum Shinrikyo. Now I think he's working in a Chinese university, which is maybe the best place for him.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. So, all right. So
Dropped out of school.
Segues aplenty, I am sure.
Yeah.
But let's get back to the main track. So, okay, so you drop out of high school, and where does young Jon go from there?
I played drums in bands for a couple of years.
This is early 70s now, yeah?
Yeah, this is dropped out of school in 72.
Yep.
And spring of 72. Smoked dope, took acid, did the things that were perfectly normal at that time. Played
Disqualified
drums.
yourself for the Sea Org?
Thankfully, yes. Though, of course, that qualification only changed a couple of years after I got in. There were many attempts to recruit me before it. And it was so funny that so many of the senior SEAL people that I interviewed later, of course, had taken LSD, as, of course, had Ron Hubbard. And he boasted about this to David Mayo, not in an auditing session. And that I had a letter from a guy who said, oh, my guru took LSD with Ron Hubbard. And as you will find, people who've taken LSD are stupid. Do you know the story behind
Hubbard,
that?
Yep.
You know the story behind that bulletin? That LSD, years after they've come off of LSD.
Go ahead and tell it, because this might be interesting. For people, just a little background, folks, is for those who don't know or aren't tracking, the Sea Org has requirements, the billion-year contract people, right? The highest levels of Scientology.
Sailor-suited people.
And one of those requirements is that you not have taken LSD or its derivatives. That's the exact quote from the issue. And this is something that Hubbard was so serious about that he wrote this issue, which we're about to talk about, in the late 70s, where he said, this is non-petitionable. This is not, there's no exception to this. And anybody in the Sea Org who recruits someone who has taken LSD will go to the RPF, which is the most severe punishment you can get.
The Rehabilitation Project Force.
The re-indoctrination system.
The Gulag.
That's right.
And basically, the bulletin is called LSD Years After They've Come Off of LSD. Very eloquent. It's 1977, I think. And it starts on research into two cases. And I remember first reading it and getting research into two cases. This is a determination of what the gold standard for research is 1,000 cases with a proper control group. But let's not worry about it. It's a science. He told us it's a science, so it must be. And so I met a guy called Harvey Haber after I'd left, who had worked with Hubbard on the technical films, as they called them then. It's amazing. They all disappeared, didn't they? Hubbard made all of these little films, and they all disappeared. So the ones I saw, I can understand why. There's a great one with David Mayo where he's saying, now, if this film it disappears, you'll know what happened. And it did.
It did. It's true. It did. All of Hubbard's original films are gone. They don't show them anymore. They've remade them all with new actors and stuff.
Yeah, because they were dreadful. But Harvey said I was one of the two cases. I said, oh.
What?
Yeah. He said, no, not me, him. Harvey
was. Oh, Harvey was. Okay. Oh, because I was like, wait a minute, what?
That would be wild.
Yeah, that would be crazy. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Harvey was. Okay.
Harvey Haber was one of the two cases. And he said what had happened was that he'd pissed Hubbard off. And, by not putting a chair in the right place or something really profoundly evil, not rinsing his underwear 15 times, only doing it 14 times, or wearing rose perfume or something despicable. And this woman had pissed him off. And so what Hubbard had done was a folder error summary. He had their complete auditing dossiers, which could be, massive, gone through to find out what they had in common. What they had in common was they'd both taken LSD. That was the research on which the bulletin that excluded people. And as I say, he admitted to having taken it himself, along with just about every other drug imaginable. And that he confessed to having been a barbiturate addict in a lecture. He recommended amphetamines. He said that alcohol in Dianetics, modern science, alcohol is the most dangerous drug, which of course is probably true.
Happened to accidentally get that one right.
Yeah, but he of course, had a sclerotic liver by the time he died because it didn't stop him from drinking or smoking 100 cigarettes a day or what have you. But so yeah, I did what middle-class kids did, white kids did. Back then, I was a hippie, with long hair, and I played drums in rock groups and You know, I wanted to play in Yes or King Crimson, but they wouldn't have me. And their drummers were better than me anyway, which was really not fair. And then I was 19. I was in Toulouse, in the south of France. I was there because this guitar player had told me we've got lots of gigs there. I get there with my drum kit and find there's nothing. And I get stranded there for 6 weeks. I very nearly starve. I have a week of 1 franc a day, which would buy me a loaf of bread. And I'm gluten intolerant, so that probably didn't do me any good. So I had to abandon my drum kit to get home. I get home, and the girl I'd been living with for 15 months has evaporated in thin air. And her stepdad tells me how much he's always hated me because I read his copy of the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, and I understood it. And to this day, I don't know if he meant that it was impossible for anybody to understand it on first reading, because I certainly didn't. And so he was saying, you know, I was a pretentious fool, which I probably was. Or if he was resentful, this book of wisdom, he'd spent years trying to understand it, and I seemed to have understood it, so he hated my guts. You know, he's a very odd man.
Yeah, it kind of misses the point of ultimate wisdom.
Slightly, you know.
You know, a little bit. Just a little bit.
But, so he wouldn't tell me where she was. Nobody would tell me where she was. And it proved that she'd actually shacked up with one of my friends and decided she was going to move to New Zealand with him. And which was, I think, was probably a good decision. You know, he was a lovely guy, you know, but let's just leave it there. They're not together anymore. They've not been together for about 30 years, but never mind. But
who's keeping track?
Yeah, exactly. I had some children and stuff like that. But it's kind of odd because it wouldn't be fair to say that I was smitten with this young woman, but you know, probably just my ego was so badly damaged at the thought of somebody abandoning me. But I got very upset, and I got back to England on the 5th of November. I read Science of Survival, the first of the 2 books of Science of Survival.
You started with that one.
Well, I was at a friend's house, and one of his friends loved the Incredible String Band, had heard they were in Scientology, had gone to the library, had got Science of Survival out, found it complete nonsense. I recruited him a few months later into Scientology. And I was there alone in the house, and I was upset, and there was this book, and I read, it's divided into 2 halves, book 1, book 2. I read book 1, and it's all looks practical. There's no reincarnation. That wouldn't have bothered me. I was a Buddhist by profession at that time, but it was all, you know, brain and attention units and therapy, and it looked very sensible. So I went and
I must ask you, because I'm vastly curious here. So, because this is pretty typical, you know, this happens all the time. People catch a book at a friend's house, or they buy the book on the street or at a bookstore or something, and they start reading it. And Science of Survival, like you said, is the second book. It was written after Dianetics. In 1951 is when Hubbard wrote it.
Published in June 51.
Yeah. And in it, Hubbard talks about a thing called the emotional tone scale and how you chart emotions. That's basically, there's a chart which says it can predict human behavior, a bunch of little boxes as to the kind of behavior, and then the number, you know, of the emotion connected with it and what you can expect out of somebody, right? So there we go. So a person very high up on the chart, you know, high number, tone or emotion, and you're going to see positive things. They're going to love kids. They're going to get along great with their spouse. They're going to be honest. They're going to be very forthright. They're going to be very dedicated to a cause and trustworthy. But you go lower and lower and lower, and you find more and more base behavior and, you know, sexual abuse of kids and stuff like this at the lower
The sort of
ends.
things that Hubbard did.
Yeah, exactly. So seeing this chart out of nowhere, and then reading Hubbard's stuff about it, including, this is the book that Jeffrey Augustine likes to go on about, because it's got this business about, you know, just wholesale getting rid of a group of people you don't like, right? He talks about the Venezuelan leader who put all the lepers on a barge and sailed the barge out to the middle of the water in a river or some lake or something where they were all told they were going off to their own special place. Turns out they were, because he blew it up and they were all dead. And Hubbard touted this as a positive, or at least not a negative, solution to that problem. And so I'm curious, do you remember reading that for the first time? Because I don't. I think I glossed right over it.
I don't remember it now, actually.
Okay, no, it's fine. I was just curious because, like I said, that's a fun. It's not often that is the first book somebody reads. So I was curious about your impressions of it.
In any of the books, any of them. I mean, you've also, in Science of Survival, you've got stuff about a woman's places in the home, and any time that women become involved with business or running a country, things will go badly wrong. And
yes, you do.
I suppose with Indira Gandhi and Margaret Thatcher and Golda Meir, they probably did. But Venezuelan dictator, yeah, it's right here, 157. It's in the book that I read. Why did I get involved in this thing? I love Venezuela.
Well, like I said, I have to say, I mean, I point this out, but also, and Jeffrey makes, loves this particular quote, but I have to say that the first time I read it, I wasn't in a frame of mind where I was critically analyzing what I was reading, and I read it and I thought, okay, that's a little weird, but this is L. Ron Hubbard and he's the man, so whatever. So I just kind of brushed right past it the times that I read it. But after I got out and he pointed that out, I thought to myself, wow, did I really miss a very huge red flag right there that I just glossed right over, I
mean, we're just about to put up a sort of a spoken version of a paper I wrote many years ago, 25 years ago, which is called Never Believe a Hypnotist, which is in fact a quotation from Science of Survival. And the thing that got me when I wrote the paper, and I wrote it in 93 originally, so I'd been out for nearly 10 years, was that if you read Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health slowly, you realize that he contradicts himself every few pages. But I read that book 3 times while I was involved in Scientology. I didn't see anything, so where he says hypnosis was never used, hypnosis is sometimes used, Dianetics is based upon hypnosis, some of the major discoveries, but it was never used. And they're within pages of each other. Now, I mean, I later recognized this is the double bind technique, where you give people conflicting statements so they can't think anymore. But, so much of it gets past. But you're quite right. He talks here about the Venezuelan dictator rounding everybody up, and basically, this is a method of getting rid of leprosy, apparently. I mean,
exactly.
You have the European ships of fools where they gather up the insane, put them on a ship and just send it off.
Jesus, I didn't know that's where that expression came from. Jesus Christ, that's horrible.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awful. Okay, well, anyway, a little trip down memory lane there. But so this was your first book. So you were saying, I totally interrupted you. So what were your remembered impressions of this, and what did it draw you in further, or what happened?
Oh, it sold me. I would later find that it was actually written by Richard DeMille, not by Ron Hubbard. Hubbard never wrote another book after Modern Science of Mental Health. They're all compilations from his notes. But DeMille told me that, he accurately represented what Hubbard was saying. It's the most coherent of all the Scientology books. DeMille he's a very bright man. Indeed, he became a professor of psychology after escaping, and had something to do with Carlos Castaneda's downfall. What an evil man he was. But I was desperately unhappy. I read this book and I thought, this is a therapy. This is straightforward, and so I was cautious. I called. I was not involved with the Christian church at all. I was indeed, had abandoned it at the age of 13. But I thought, well, they seem to be claiming to be a religion now. They call it the Church of Scientology. It said in the frontispiece of the book, the Church of Scientology. That sounds a bit dodgy. So I phoned up an Anglican minister and I said, what do you know about these people? He said, I've never heard of them, don't know anything about them. And that was the end of the inquiry. Now, speaking of inquiries, it was only 3 years before the British government had published their extensive inquiry, the Foster report. And this guy should have said, I'll get back to you, if he'd been any kind of decent human being, and gone and checked. But he didn't. He was like, I talked to my doctor, general practitioner, and said, know anything about this? No, don't know anything about it. And I had a friend who was a psychiatrist, the evil people who rule the universe. Remember them? In a big conspiracy. And she's a lovely woman. She thought electroconvulsive therapy was a horrible thing to do to people. But I find her up, and she said, I don't know anything about them. And so I went, well, okay, I'll go along. And I went there. And
this was 1975, yeah?
This was the 11th of December, 1974. Moved to the
11th of December, 1974?
Yeah, that's right.
That was my birthday, dude. That's funny.
So I think it's your fault.
That's funny. Yep. Yeah, right.
In 1974?
Yeah, 4 years old. That was
You're
my fourth
4 years
birthday.
Old, born in 1974.
That's right. And
sweet.
that also was around the time that my parents got involved in Scientology, because I was 4 years old when they got involved. So it was sometime within that time period too. So interesting.
Maybe
so
they were celebrating your birthday, as I obviously was.
Right.
And I went to the Moseley Birmingham mission, or franchise. They were still occasionally called franchises then, more accurately, of the Church of Scientology. And there were these great people. They'd all recently graduated from Bournemouth Polytechnic, which would later become a university. They had kind of arts degrees, and they were just these smiley, happy, lovely people. And within a couple of weeks, I'd moved into the house where they lived, and they wanted to hire me, they wanted me on staff, but the people who owned the mission, Don and Stephanie Ryburn, were away, and they'd prohibited them hiring anybody. So that was my first lucky break, Because
let me ask you about this, because I'm again really intensely curious here. So you read the book, you have a positive impression, you go check, you do your due diligence, and everybody's like, I don't know. So you go, okay, cool, call them up, let's go check it out. So you walk into this place for the first time. This is a mission. It's staffed by these people from the Polytechnic Institute. But what did it look like? How many people were there? What was the size of the place?
It was relatively small. They had as I remember, a course room, the office that the executive director, Jill Pesish, was in, and I think a couple of other rooms. And the course room would probably take about 20 people. And, so they'd have a couple of auditing rooms, and they'd often actually go around the corner to the house, which, again, the Ryburns owned and where they lived, and used rooms there. We had to go around there to do TR8 if we were going to shout at ashtrays. They didn't want anybody to know. As far as I remember, there were only 2 people there when I arrived in the afternoon. And I was told that what I'd have to do was read this book, Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, and it was £1. And I didn't have £1. I'd had my train fare, my bus fare, my return, and that was it. And so I said, well, I'll come in tomorrow and bring you the £1. And it was like, no. We can't let you have anything. So that was a little bit of a warning sign. They don't trust people. And instead, they gave me 2 copies of what was called Advance magazine about Ron Hubbard being Maitreya, the Buddha who will end the universe by taking everybody into nirvana. And I'd never heard of this, and I'd been involved with Zen Buddhism for a couple of years. And it was absolutely the wrong thing to give me. I immediately, when I got home, wrote a letter to the Pali Text Society to say, this thing says a red-headed man will arise 2,500 years after the Buddha and become the Maitreya, and he will be a Westerner. What can you tell me? And I got a letter back the next week saying, this is abject nonsense. It's a reference to the Book of the Great Decease, which has no prediction of date, says nothing about him being red-haired, and says nothing about him being in the West. It is pretty much a myth. which some of the Tibetans still believe,
Okay, interesting.
I mean, I would
Interesting.
later.
And that act alone, by the way, I'm just going to throw this out there, puts you above about 99% of the rest of the people who heard that bullshit, including me. And I've always got the excuse I can fall back on that I was raised with this shit. But still, it gives, even then, that they didn't even fact check that. They just went, oh, it's some legend out of the East. Well, I clearly don't know anything about that, so what they're telling me must be true. And I bought all that Buddha stuff, hook, line, and sinker when I was in.
I got two good stories about that. One of them is I interviewed John Sanborn. John Sanborn was the head of publications from 1954 to 1978. When he was asked to transfer another $1 million into L. Ron Hubbard's bank account. And he said, I've had this. I've been living on $5 a week for 24 years. And this guy is, living the life of Riley at my expense. But he edited every book, all of the tech volumes, everything that came out, John did. And he was a lovely guy. He was a really smart guy. And he did a very good job with the books, all things considered. But he said Hubbard, one of the first things Hubbard gave him was Hymn of Asia in 1954. And in
1954?
1954, and said, here, this is my poem. And
now that's fascinating. I thought it was much later than that. Interesting.
He held on to it for 20 years because he couldn't stand it. Because it said, I am Matea. And then he had this realization that if he changed the wording and said, am I Matea, that he could live with it. And so he published it in a beautiful edition, I think, the prettiest of all the Scientology books. But if you see me dead, I will then live forever, but you will see a world in flames, all this abject nonsense. The other story, however, in 1982, a man called Brown McKee gave testimony at the Clearwater hearings in Florida. And he had been involved with Scientology for 25 years, I think. And it was a very sad story. It was about his wife developing cancer and basically being told, there's nothing we can do to help you. And them ending up in some clinic in Mexico where the whole waiting room was full of Scientology OTs. All these people who, because they hadn't gone and got proper medical treatment immediately, they degenerated and become terminal. But he said, I was a physicist. And so I knew that what Hubbard was saying about physics was nonsense. But I was really interested by what he was saying about Buddhism. Okay, well, I was a Buddhist, and I knew what he was saying about Buddhism was nonsense. But it's really interesting what he said about physics.
Right, that's how it works.
And then you see Hubbard writing about gamma rays and things like that, and you go, oh dear, he didn't understand anything. It's this thing that Hubbard said that all you have to do is adopt the beingness, and then you are the thing, So you just say, I'm the world's greatest philosopher. You don't have to actually study Schopenhauer and Nietzsche or any of that stuff. You just proclaim yourself. And that's pretty much what he did. His study of most things was pretty shallow, having followed in his footsteps to see what he was reading.
I have to comment right now, just because the parallel is so obvious and it really should be said out loud, I think that was the number one lesson that David Miscavige learned from L. Ron Hubbard. Because when he took over Scientology, he was on a wing and a prayer, but that didn't stop him because he had realized that power is assumed.
We see.
Anyway, I just had to comment on that because I thought that was, I've never heard anybody put it exactly the way you just put it. And I thought that was very spot on and a great description of young David Miscavige taking over the church and going hell-bent for leather despite not really having a clue what he was doing.
Not really having any education at all, having dropped out of school at the age of 13 and taken a huge amount of corticosteroids to deal with asthma, which, poor man.
That's right.
But and we have stories of him at age 14 being quite brutal, and when he's 17 when he's on Hubbard's crew. when I interviewed Didi Vogadin, who'd been his boss when he was action chief, she said the thing with David was that if you needed something done, he was incredible. You'd say, David, that wall there needs knocking down. He would lower his head and charge. And, sad for many people, and he's hurt many people. But there you go. So yeah, I did check, but the people I met were great. Gillian Zoran-Pesic, Linda Harrington, Eddie. Eddie had he was a glass engraver, and he ended up. Yeah, it's a very difficult thing to do. And his wife was Jenny Wiggins. They were just these lovely people. Fred Allback, who later ended up on David Mayo's staff. And I did some questions for our channel the other day that a friend had sent me. And he said, was there anything I regret about having left Scientology? And I found myself in tears, kind of going, yeah, these people, these wonderful people who then spent their lives, several of them, trapped in the Sea organization. People who are talented and good, who just were turned into cogs in this machine for enslaving people psychologically and taking all their money away from them. That I do regret. Nothing else. That camaraderie. So they were great, and I went back the next day with my pound and read.
Despite the Buddhist nonsense,
Well,
that took a week for you to find out. That took a week for you to find. Yeah, so you went back the next day and you did get the book.
Yeah, and my thought was really, he's a man, he's fallible. They'd shown me that he said that. This looks like it might work, and why on earth? I mean, Dianetics: The Modern Science of Mental Health is one of the most dreadful books ever written. It's a mess. But there's that thing that when you can't quite grasp something, you think it might be too clever for you. And it's the common aspect of the psychopath is that they cannot express themselves properly in language. And so they speak gibberish frequently. And you start thinking, oh, when I'm more advanced in the teaching, I will understand what the master says. And I did finally come to understand what the master says. And it's basically, give me your money, give me your life, and give me your children. And I will consume all of those things,
Right. So you go down there, you got Dianetics, you've read Science of Survival. Even after sorting out the Buddha thing, you're like, okay, well, let's get to it.
Yep.
So how far do you go? What happens at this mission?
Well, I did the communication course, the training routines. I did the basic dictionary course. That was free. It's the only free thing I ever got. I did a personality test, free personality test. And it was actually assessed by Linda Harrington, who later became Linda Jones. Lovely woman. I think she had a degree in English. And she said something that it took me 10 years to get the answer to. She said that she wasn't going to do the usual evaluation on this. And I've still got the personality test because I'm a bit of a hoarder. And I'm running at kind of 90% along the top.
Oh,
and it was only when I saw the manual that I realized you could have dropped me to minus 90 because everybody's below death.
Right. So what did she tell you?
She basically told me I was in really good shape, but Scientology would help me to help other people and to be in better shape. And my particular, I was focused on just one thing, which was that I was traumatically upset about my girlfriend leaving me. And that was never once in the 9 years I was in Scientology, it was never once addressed in any way. A year later, I wasn't thinking about that anymore, as is normal with human beings. So, unless, of course, they're Dante Alighieri, in which case, having seen a 9-year-old girl, they're obsessed for the rest of their lives. But I'm not like that, thankfully. I also don't have his genius, which is a bit disappointing, but there you go. I just have to live with it. You know?
Yes, it's these burdens we have to carry. I understand.
It's true. I did the Hubbard qualified Scientologist course, and to my amazement, my mother followed me in. She, when I was away, she went in to check, because it's only, I don't know, 15 or 20 miles away from where we lived. She went in to check that it was okay, that it wasn't some kind of nasty cult group or something, and walked into a course room where somebody was going, "Off with his head," to somebody else, and kind of went, "This is for me." And she stayed in for 8 years too. So I decided, you know, I wanted to do this properly. I wanted to go. So I went to the Manchester organisation, and I went to St Hill outside East Grinstead, south of London.
And are we still talking about the 75, 76 time period? Have we moved to 76?
This is 75. So I've been involved for a few months, and I want to go and train as an auditor, and you know, see what I can do with this. There are various offers for me to join staff, of course, and I push them all away because I've decided that I'm more useful if, you know, once I've trained and done this thing. And there was no technical training corps back then.
So in other words, staff members who train full time to get technical positions like auditors and supervisors and stuff.
Counseling.
Yeah, exactly.
Counseling positions.
So you'd gotten some taste of auditing others as well as yourself getting some auditing when you did that HQS course. That's sort of I call that course sort of a survey of basic Scientology principles is kind of what that course is about. Yeah. So you'd done that, gotten your feet wet, and then wanted more.
Yes. And so I went to the Manchester organisation to look at that. It was a condemned building with purple walls and two very desperate people in it. And I decided that probably wasn't the place for me.
Yeah, you think?
I went down to East Grinstead, and in the cab, this was August 75, in the cab ride, the driver said, "Oh, you got to watch these people. They take you into the cellar and give you electric shocks." So that was how Ron Hubbard had developed, you know, friendly relations with the public and the environment in East Grinstead. And I would later frequently be congratulated by the non-Scientology public of East Grinstead for having stood up against them. And the stories about, you know, what had happened in the 60s when Hubbard was there were just outrageous. And I got them from the people it had been done to, you know. But
while you were there, or did that all come later?
Most of it after I left. I mean, I made friends with various townspeople while I was involved, and they would be, you know, "We're not going to talk about Scientology. We like you, but we don't want anything to do with them." And that was the general feeling in the town. So there was a bookseller there who I became quite close friends with over the years, and he was an anthroposophist, Henry. And he...
I'm sorry, a what?
An anthroposophist, a follower of Rudolf Steiner. It's an offshoot of Theosophy. The headquarters 5 miles out of East Grinstead in a village called Forest Row. And they've got their own architecture. They have biodynamic agriculture. If you drink water, it's got to have been through the figure 8. You stir your soil at midnight with a sheep's head if you want your crops to grow. They've got some quite interesting things. They wear no plastic. They only wear natural fibers. And they're basically fairly gentle, hippie-ish sort of people with some very bizarre beliefs. But they make good vegetables. And the not the people, the stuff they grow, you know, with
yes,
the garden. And their houses are really quite beautiful. The Steiner houses are really, you know, they're all curves. They don't have straight lines in them. They're a bit like the sort of place you'd expect a hobbit to live in, and the sort of people you'd expect the hobbits to be, frankly.
Interesting.
They believe that they have a guardian on their shoulder that, I loved their use of the word guardian, having seen Jane Kember and what the Guardians have to do, that instructs you. It's a bit like, there's a Walt Disney movie where I think Goofy has an angel and a devil on each shoulder. It's a bit like that. A bit like Walt Disney in general, frankly, but without the cocaine, obviously, which anthroposophists don't use. But Henry Goulden was a friend of mine, and I there was another bookseller there, a guy called John Woods, and they really liked me, but they hated Scientology. So, but then after I left, there were shopkeepers there who'd shake my hand and say, loved your book and thank you for standing up against these people. And you found out how they'd infiltrated things like the Christmas Lights Committee, so that East Grinstead puts up lights at Christmas. And then actually, I talked with, I think it was Maria Flint, that she'd actually got onto the committee and they managed to put up these Scientology crosses. They tricked them, and the townspeople were not very happy. But
yeah, people don't like being lied to. It's kind of funny.
No,
I think you've commented on that a couple times.
I have noticed it from time to time. So around, it must have been September '75, I moved with my girlfriend, my then girlfriend, who would later become my first wife and the mother of my first two children. We moved down and we arrived at the house of Felix Patel. It's all coming back to me now. And which was my lodging. This had been arranged for me by St. Hill. And it's sort of 10:30 at night, and we knock on the door, and this guy takes one look at me and says, "You're not staying here," because I've got long hair. And he was in the Guardian's office, so he was a highly ethical person and couldn't have a long-haired person. So at 10:30 at night, I have to try and find somewhere to stay. And
he wouldn't let you stay at his place that had been arranged by the church for you to stay there because you had long hair. Is that really what it was like in the 70s?
Yep.
God damn, man. God damn.
But it changes.
Okay, please continue.
Changes from century to century, and my dad used to say, how girly it was to have long hair. And I'd say, well, what about Jesus? But apparently it was all right if you lived in Palestine at a particular time.
Right.
Wasn't making any other comparison. I didn't have a beard or sandals.
Right. Your dad's like, yeah, you're not committed enough. You want to convince me grow a beard?
Yeah,
let's see some sandals and robes.
John the Baptist to baptize me.
Right.
So I moved down there. I went on course full time. I did the Hubbard Dianetic Auditor course, which is what would later become the Neurodianetic Auditor course and would move in its place. I did
sort of advanced level Dianetics is what we would call it at this point, with using an e-meter, because it's like that. It incorporates that into it. The first Dianetics, the book Dianetics, and the stuff that's done out of that book is simpler, a lot easier, and it doesn't have anything to do with using the e-meter as far as like a difference, of these things.
And was all cancelled in 1951 by Hubbard because it was hypnotic.
Right. Well, yeah.
In
there's
the book
that
Science of Survival. And was reintroduced in 1977, including the fluttering of the eyelids and all the hypnotic things that he complained about. As I say, never believe a hypnotist. We're putting that up sometime in the next week, and it'll bore the hell out of anybody because it's 2 hours of rant about Hubbard talking about hypnosis. But the course I did was the one with the e-meter, which would later become the new era Dianetic Auditor course. And I did the Method 1 course. I did Class 0, Class 1. And then a woman called Ivis Bolger, who looks like she sounds, and wore jack boots, which the Navy uniforms, that really bothered me from the start. It was like, this looks to me like kind of Berlin in 1934. This is not.
Oh, right. We should be clear with people out there about something. St. Hill is manned by Sea Org members. It's not a regular, like the London church or the Manchester church or the Detroit church or the local Denver church here. Those are manned by staff who just sign little contracts for a couple of years. St. Hill is the major base of operations for Scientology in England, and it is a Sea Org base. So, yeah, you were seeing uniforms and stuff. What do you think about all that?
I thought it was crazy.
Did you say that? Did you ever ask about it?
I don't remember having any conversations about it, which is odd for me. There are a couple of hundred people on the staff there, and they didn't wear their campaign medals which I would have asked about because, of course, it's a criminal offence, both in the US and here, to wear campaign medals unless you've earned them in the military. So
interesting.
Like these little ribbons, which is like successfully managed to go to the toilet. Get one for that, and the how to write your name course, and the, you know, I mean, whatever.
Yes,
but,
you can get a lot of campaign ribbons very quickly as a Sea Org member. That is true.
I went and I did these courses. I ended up working as a painter and decorator to make a living, which was pretty strange. I started writing scripts. I was 20, and I had the BBC take a play script to the final reading. And Granada TV said that they would have taken one of my scripts if they hadn't commissioned one on school holidays, you know, a week before. So I got that far trying to develop a career as a writer, and then I ran into Ivis Bolger. And Ivis Bolger decided that because I had an unpaid fine of about £30, that I was a criminal. And so she took me off course, which was quite a favour, because I just decided I didn't want to be there anymore. There were various people there who were bullying and aggressive, which I didn't respond to. You know, I don't like being bullied. And so I could name some names here, but I'd probably better not, because some of them might still be alive. But there was generally this push to get statistics, this get money out of people, hard selling. You know, the registrars, the salespeople were really nice, and they wanted your money, and just the whole atmosphere seemed wrong to me. So I left in February '77. I just went back to the Midlands, where I, you know, stayed with my parents for a little while, sort of things out. And I had 2 years where I really wasn't very involved. I went to art college, which was great. Studied painting, made a very meager living for 4 years after leaving college as a painter, largely due to the help of my friends and family more than prolific sales. But I went back to, you know, I bought a couple of houses, you know, which is to say I got mortgages and paid up £1,000 in deposit, and the housing market was moving. So from the first house, I had £1,000 profit, which I put into the second house, which I spent 3 years renovating, and then gave the, you know, £3,500 that I'd made to Scientology to buy the OT levels. And meanwhile, had been pulled back into Scientology in Manchester, which now, you know, and in fact, I was in charge of the renovation of the Deansgate building. So if you want to see a suppressive edifice, you know, this is a 5-story bank building, and we had, I think it was 4 weeks. And because the guy running it, who would rather not be named publicly, because he's a well-known figure now, lovely guy, he managed to take it from nothing to 38 staff in this building with hundreds of people coming through. And I had 4 weeks because he'd seen that I was renovating my house. And he'd done the conversation we talked about earlier, where he'd said, well, what are the problems you're having with Scientology? You know, I bitched for a little while, and he'd say, oh, it's terrible, it's terrible, it's terrible. Why don't you come up to Manchester and give me some of your money? And I was renovating a house, so he made me the renovations in charge for this building. And I had all of the crew, the 38 crew, so they'd work through the day for him, and they'd work through the night making a mess of this building because they were largely, utterly incompetent. And they got a Sea Organization mission, Phil Stannard and Alan Bailey, who were both lovely people, though Alan did try and kill me at one point, because I told him off because his crew had ruined their brushes one night because they decided to use them to stab the paint on. And as I was in charge of buying new brushes and stuff, they just wasted his stuff. And I told him off, and he bunched his fists and started coming towards me. But Phil, you probably don't know the legend of Phil Stannard. He was run over when he was 11 years old and lost a leg. So he had a prosthetic leg. And he was quite a good guitar player. And he'd been L. Ron Hubbard communicator at and was apparently busted because he decided that part of the routing form for young women joining the Sea Org was to have sex with him. So the legend has it. So there was a little bit of exploitation going on there.
Whoa.
Possibly.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true. It's an allegation that was made. Phil left a long time ago. But they were there, and we were running this thing, and we had the office of L. Ron Hubbard to make and all of this stuff, and no money. And I had to tell the staff that they could not put copies of the Auditor on the floor to soak up the water because there were pictures of L. Ron Hubbard on it. We mustn't be treading on pictures of L. Ron Hubbard. God, imagine that. But I went from Manchester back down to St. Hill. I did I was declared natural clear. Question 46 on the list. In Manchester, have you always been clear? Needle floats. Yes, you've always been clear. Which theoretically, and I've said this elsewhere, means you're also natural OT3. Because if you weren't here when the R6 bank, the reactive mind, was implanted 75 million years ago, if you're a natural clear, you don't have it. And where would you have got the body thetans from? Because you weren't implanted with the body thetans either. So this is I can see you're very puzzled by this, you know.
Well, I'm only going to push back a little bit because I know that Hubbard actually wrote that body thetans are not just a phenomena of OT3. So, but
they are.
So you
but the R6 bank is. The active mind is.
That's what's surprising to me. That's the one I went, oh, really? Because I didn't know that was the case, and that interests me. So I'm gonna look into that more because I thought there was something earlier to that. But I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying I'm fascinated by that piece of information, and I'm going to look into that.
Incident 2 is
the 4 quadrillion years ago thing, that's first entry into the physical universe. But that's not when the bank is created. I thought there was something else, but like I said, I'm not talking from a position of knowledge. So
yeah, the 36 days of implanting are the OT3 incident 75 million years ago, which is called Incident 2. Incident 1 is the entry into the universe, and I hate to say this, but I have yet to meet anybody who did OT3 who did not have a misunderstood word on the word cherub. Because the first incident on the time track, however many quadrillion years ago, and I thought the quadrillion was a dance actually rather than a period of time, but let's not worry about that. The first incident is a cherub blowing a trumpet. Mm-hmm. You know what a cherub is?
I thought it was an angelic baby figure with little wings.
Yeah. Cherubim and seraphim, look it up. They are great big monsters.
Oh, well, I am going to note that down.
It changed its meaning. So that's why OT3 doesn't work. Because everybody got a misunderstood word on cherub.
Oh, is that why?
Yeah.
Oh, I was wondering, because I thought it was just that it was absolutely batshit crazy. Okay.
It is also batshit crazy because if you take that many drugs, and when I interviewed Virginia Downsborough, who rescued Hubbard, she said he was taking a shelf load of drugs. He was out of his mind. And keep your voice down because I have some people doing the course in the next room. Okay, you saw where it came from and you're still selling it, you know, but she was great, Virginia. You know, she was a charming woman. And she apparently told David Mayo what all those drugs were because she wouldn't tell me. In 2013, when I talked to David for the first time in sort of 17 years or something, I said, he said, oh, yeah, she told me. I said, what were they? What were they? And he wouldn't tell me. I think probably because he didn't remember or he'd written it down somewhere and he never did tell me. So, but Demerol, phenobarbital, amphetamines, they were certainly on the shelf. That I think we can say.
Interesting.
And pinks and
I have to ask you, since this has never come up before to ask, and since we're sitting here talking about it in the course of the life story here, I've been told by a couple of people who were his in messenger positions in the later years, right? Well, actually, all through the 70s, actually from the beginning, that there were no drugs. And I wonder what's your take on that? Because I'm surely you've heard that.
Yeah, well, the only person I've heard it from is, what's her name, who wrote Janice Gillam.
Specifically, yeah.
Yeah, that's the only messenger who's told me that.
Okay.
She also said that she only ever once saw him take a drink in 11 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I've talked to somebody who on the ship saw him injecting drugs during the
Wow.
time she was a messenger, because she was a messenger from the very start.
Right.
And you've got this thing, well, how public would you be about something once you declared that it was not to be done? And how easy would it be? Now, I also talked with, I think, with Dr. Stephen Jarvis, who signed prescription pads for him when he was on the ship. Hubbard himself tried to cash a prescription in '65 in East Grinstead for Nembutal, phenobarbital, barbiturate drug, Dr. L. Ron Hubbard. We've been told that Eugene Denk signed prescription pads for him at the end. We know that Vistaril was in his system when he died. It's in the autopsy. Well, there was no autopsy. It's in the post-mortem report. Piecing together from people, his primary drug was alcohol. Hannah saw him drunk, even if Janice didn't. I'm also told, however, that the messengers used to help him shower, and she doesn't talk about that. Her sister says that he tried to kiss her when she was 12, and I mean, not just a little peck.
Really?
Yes. So.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'm not taking anybody's word as gospel, but I thought this was an appropriate time to ask about it because I wanted to see what you would.
I think it's an extraordinarily important point. That, when I interviewed, there's material from Richard DeMille and from Barbara Cloden, going back. Barbara Cloden, who's absolutely brilliant, just a wonderful woman. There's an interview that I think I gave to Tony Ortega, which he has up on the bunker, which was given to me by the producer of The Secret Life of L. Ron Hubbard, which is still my favorite documentary about Scientology after The Shrinking World of L. Ron Hubbard, which is Charlie Nairn's masterpiece. But Barbara Cloden said that while he was starting to write Science of Survival, when they were living together in Los Angeles towards the end of 1950, he still married bigamously to Sarah, the second wife that he never had, according to Shrinking. Very complicated. While they were living together, he was morose and depressed and lying in bed all the time and didn't know what to do to follow up the success of Dianetics. Of course, Art Sepos, the publisher of Dianetics, I think in October 1950, pulled it from the shelves because he said the guy's a charlatan, it's a fraud. So even though he was making money, they'd sold 150,000 copies. Sepos was like, I'm a medical publisher. I cannot have this book out there. So Hubbard's going, I need something else to make money from. I can't think of anything. And she said he was drinking a bottle of scotch a day. He then kidnaps his own baby, Alexis, and runs off for a few weeks to Cuba with Richard DeMille. And Richard DeMille told me he was drinking a bottle of rum a day. So how easy is it to pop a few pills when your 11-year-old messenger isn't looking? And did he have some tiny amount of conscience, or was he going, if the 11-year-olds see me taking drugs, they might tell someone? And what state was he in? When we see him on films, when we hear him in lectures, he is stoned out of his crate almost every time. He comes onto the stage, he goes, what day is it?
That's true. He's always doing that at St. Hill in the lectures in the 60s. That's
and
right.
Hannah said that this was something that we didn't know because most of the lectures aren't filmed. And she saw, briefing course lectures in, I think, 63, 64, 65. I'm not sure when he arrived there. But she said he would start the lecture, give the title, having worked out what day it was, and then there'd be this weird exaggerated gesture that he'd make, and he'd start telling a story. And you and I and many other people have noticed that the beginning of the lecture is about the subject. Then there's 30 minutes of him rambling, like people on drugs do, about something passed down the track or some retelling of some story that he's told with different information elsewhere, which was the thing that fascinated me as a biographer. He seemed incapable of telling a story the same way twice. So it's a Kodiak bear that he wrestled with in one, a polar bear in another, brown bear in another. Now, that could be him giving us a clue about psychopathic disorder, the inability to tell the truth, that even retelling a story would be like telling the truth if you told it with the same details. He was a pathological liar. And of course, he said things only persist if they contain a lie. Altruismus, as he said. So we could say, what is the lie in Scientology? And the lie that maintains Scientology is very simple. The lie is that it works, as L. Ron Hubbard says it works, as opposed to it working, as L. Ron Hubbard Jr. said, as L. Ron Hubbard intends it to work.
Exactly. That's right. It does work. It's just not working the way you think it's working.
He exhibited the characteristics of a multiple drug abuser, an alcoholic. We know that he had problems with drugs. He did say to messengers that he wished he could give up smoking. And eventually, of course, he did. But he smoked 100 cigarettes a day and found a knocking on. And, somebody's taking amphetamines.
All valid points.
Somebody's taking amphetamines, they just slip a few down and away they go. And it's always been interesting because knowing what I know, knowing what we all know now about memory and stuff, right? That memory is malleable and memory is reconstructed. The constructionist point of view, as psychologists call it, that yes, we reconstruct memory. It is not actually recorded like video.
Exactly. There's so far zero mechanism has been found in here for a storage place for memories. Memories are spontaneously, dynamically reconstructed when they are remembered. And it is fascinating how altered they can become. And of course, how we tell ourselves stories. I even went over this with Reckless Ben in an earlier podcast, was how they messed with him in a Dianetics session. And he had a completely different memory of a very important and almost fatal accident that had happened to him. And it was only his friends who were there who had to correct him after his 10-hour Dianetics session where his memories had been completely screwed with. So I have to put that out there as a possibility, not as any kind of I have to put that out there for my own memories. That I have to be careful about my own memories about things. There's some things I'm very, very sure about, but I'm at the point now, having learned what I've learned about memory, where I kind of, don't go there so much with my personal story about things that might have happened that I'm a little shaky about, because I know that my memory can be messed with. So that's why you see me not do that,
I have seen you not do that.
Yeah, you've right.
You're doing it now.
I'm not doing it right this second.
There are a couple of things there. There's what's called a multiple drafts theory of memory, which says that every time you tell a story, every time you recall a memory, you make a new memory. Mm-hmm. And so a fish that was originally this big.
That's right.
The other one is the famous one that's usually cited is the Challenger study that in January 1986, L. Ron Hubbard's death was knocked off the front pages when the Challenger exploded, and the astronauts aboard it, of course, all died. And that day, a professor had his students write down what they'd seen, their observation of this terrible tragedy. And I think it was 2 years later that he contacted them, and he had them write down again what their memory was of finding out about the Challenger. One of the guys famously said, well, that's in my handwriting, but it's not what happened, when he saw the original account.
Wow. And he had written it down right that day.
Yeah. So
he had a total different memory.
He has a different memory. And that's part of the way we interact with groups of people. Because I'm a memory man, that's one of the things I'm known for, is regurgitation of facts. Sometimes they're not true as well. Sometimes I get the date wrong or something like that. And unlike most people, I'm actually really grateful if people will point that out, because that's why I have a good memory, because I'm willing to trust it and I'm willing to check it. Those two things are there. I won't, because again, there was a wonderful study where they asked people to just say the first thing that came into their head in one group and to think about it in another. And they found that people were more accurate if they said the first thing that came into their head. I put that down to the education system, that I will check myself over facts, because teachers made me very nervous about information. So I know that 7 times 7 is 49, but I will quickly check what 7 times 8 is before I tell you, because of that anxiety. And I think many people, it's said with autistic savants that it's possibly they don't have this checking function. So sometimes, like the Rain Man, they have astonishing memories, unbelievable memories, way beyond anything I can do.
Right.
So that's self-critical. So you've got all of these things going on with memory. If you then add confirmation bias, how does this person want to see Ron Hubbard? Do they want to see him as the savior of humanity? Because the reality is he wasn't. Do they want to see him as a man who gave us magical powers? The reality is he didn't. When you look at the claims made for a clear in Dianetics, the 273 people that he claims in that book that he had checked these techniques on, it gets rid of asthma, allergies, short-sightedness. Later on, of course, he'll claim it gets rid of cancer, leukemia, and you can raise people from the dead. These are all lies. These are all lies. So my perspective of him is not, when I spent time around him, yes, he shouted a lot and he swore a lot, but he was, the incarnation of Buddha. Once I found that he screamed and yelled a lot, I was already, which only came to me very late on in my involvement. In fact, returning to the story of Jon.
I was going to say, nice segue right back. Yeah, exactly.
One of the first things that bothered me before I went down to St. Hill to do OT levels in 81, I think, a guy called Peter Warren, who was a Sea Org member, came and gave a talk at Birmingham. And he talked about his first day in the Sea Org. He'd arrived in the port, he'd gone aboard ship, he'd upset somebody, he'd been put over the side with a paintbrush on a plank suspended from 2 ropes. So I'm going, they're in a seaport. The water is deep. He has no safety harness. That's the way I think about things. And he says he's there for hours painting the side of the ship. And night falls. And he's on a plank, suspended by 2 ropes. Night falls. And he hears this voice. And he recognizes the voice. It's Ron Hubbard. Calling down to him, "Hey, mister, what are you doing down there?" And he says, "Oh, I'm painting the side of the ship." Now, I am expecting he's going to say, "What idiot put you over the side of the ship without a safety harness? Get him back up here immediately." But he doesn't. He says, "Put some lights on for him." That had a tremendous impact on me. I really
see that, yeah.
couldn't figure that because that did not seem to be the greatest humanitarian in all history to me.
And this was a story being relayed to you in a public venue about L. Ron Hubbard's greatness.
Yes.
And how awesome he was. Yeah. And you're sitting there going, "Wait a minute, what?" So to be clear, you had done the training at St. Hill. You were not super impressed by some of the overbearing types there, the Sea Org attitude. You went back to Manchester. That place was
a couple of years not really involved. We ran a little group where people did TRs and stuff, training routines.
Yeah.
And we would feed them to the Birmingham organization to chew up. But I personally, for 2 years, did no more Scientology. Then I did the renovations at Manchester. I did the Class 2 course there and was told that I was a natural clear. And I did the grade processes fairly rapidly and audited a few people there. I feel very fortunate that I actually received very little auditing, far less than Charles Manson. Manson had 150 hours. I had about 90, in 9 years. I had very little auditing because I do things in 2 minutes.
And this was back when Natural Clear came out. That was a very short that only lasted for a couple of years, by the way.
Yeah, where's the money in that?
Yeah, there's no money in that. So you go in and you're like, "Oh no, I was always clear." And they're not buying any of that bullshit now. Now you're going to be paying. John, yeah, it's funny because there was this little window of time. I think it was 78, 79, 80, where natural clear, past life clear, this became a real thing for a lot of Scientologists.
Into the early
and they
80s.
Were skipping up to the OT levels very quickly, which is something you can't do now.
Yeah, I mean, I remember Nora Beth Crest at at Toronto talking about, age 14, I think it was, being declared a last life clear, and suddenly her status had gone up. But I went down there. I did the Sunshine Rundown. I think I did that in Birmingham. In fact, I think after clear you were allowed to do that, which was, yeah, really. And then, but it was cheap. Then I did OT.
Was that the? Do you remember at the time if it was the walk around and notice things kind of?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's literally taking a walk and looking at things. That's what the.
And
you're paying for that, by the way. Yeah.
But I got down. I had to do confessionals, which curiously I hadn't done. That it had never arisen that I needed any of this kind of stuff, and so I was told that I'd need to buy 25 hours of auditing at £100 an hour. Again, when I got involved, it was £6 an hour. The prices really, they started doing this thing where they went up 10% a month in the UK. And
it was all over. It was the solution to inflation, according to L. Ron Hubbard.
Kept on going in the UK forever, pretty much. But yeah, the solution to inflation indeed. It was thought that the UK prices had fallen behind all of the other prices, so I think we got some extra. And Hubbard's, mathematical skills were pretty low. He didn't realise that if you did this at 10% a month pretty quickly, it's Xenu's path, isn't it? And only one grain of rice for each square of the chessboard, and double it for each one, and you end up with a lot of rice, more than you can fit on a chessboard. So I bought the OT levels. They first of all tried to tell me that I hadn't paid enough. I had to pay like 5 times more. And I showed them the contract signed by the registrar, David Beale, called Beale's Deals. They of course get 2% of what they sell. So they're the only people who actually get to eat and have clothes and cars even sometimes. So they accepted that, yes, we always deliver what we promise. They'd promised me at this ludicrous price, which was still about $3,000 or something. Then I'm told I've got to buy 25 hours of confessionals or I can't carry on. And I said, I don't need 25 hours of confessionals. And I remember the auditor saying to me, well, what makes you think that? And so I named the commanding officer at St. Hill who told me that. And eventually they accepted that the 3.5 hours I had on account would do it. So I had my confessionals, which was
you must be an amazingly smooth talker, because that is not an easy sell in any Church of Scientology at any time. In fact, it strikes me right now that there might have even been some of that verbal tech, if it isn't written, it isn't true violation there, because they should not have been taking your word for it. I just find that funny.
Well, I could quote Hubbard, and I could always find the policy letter that would support my point of view, because let's face it, anything he said he will have contradicted. So,
damn straight. That's exactly right. You were spot on. I'm not. It's not a criticism. It's just kind of funny to me,
Well, and it's of course I ended up talking a lot of people out because I'm a smooth talker, and what are you going to say? But when they tried to recruit me into this organization before, in the couple of years before I was banned from doing that, luckily. Though even that they waived for me. Actually, I was invited to join Hubbard's personal staff after the LSD thing, go over the rainbow, and I accepted. I said I'd go and play drums in his band for that bloody awful album that poor Chick Corea wasted 2 years of his life on. One of the greatest musicians in the world, spending his time. Thank you for listening. I write loads of spew. And the thing about the evil being, about the priests persuading people that they've got devils and having to pay a vast sky-high price, was it, for some priestly begons. And all they need to know is about the evil purpose. And all they need to know, it was L. Ron Hubbard's evil purpose. And
exactly.
Now you're fine.
For those of you who don't know, John's literally quoting L. Ron Hubbard lyrics from songs that were recorded in the 80s. From his lyrics or whatever, the professionals.
The Road to Freedom, it's called,
right.
and it's well worth laughing at. It really
Yes,
is the
it
most
is.
dreadful. But I was asked to go and play drums on that, and then they said, "Oh no, you need to sign a seal contract," and I said, "It's not going to happen," and that was the end of that. But so I go and I do my confessionals, which was very embarrassing because they'd assigned an auditor to me who was a friend of mine, and in female form, and you don't like to talk about those kind of things with young ladies, you know. So but 3.5 hours did it, and I was ready, and I did OT1 and went, "Oh really? Okay, all right." So I got into OT2, and oh, you're kidding me! You get the clearing course film.
Now let's go ahead and give the audience a little taste here,
We have a
because
pool.
yeah, because OT levels have also changed. They've been a little malleable over the years. What was OT1 for you? Do you remember?
Well, again, it was like the Sunshine Rundown. It's just one of those walking around and noticing things.
That's right. That's right. It's ridiculous. That's right. And, please go on.
OT2, what Hubbard had done was that grade 6, the clearing course, the original OT1, and OT2 were all what are called goals, problems, masses. Now, the best example of these is given by Shakespeare: to be or not to be. And the idea is that you'd be implanted with these double binds, and Hubbard knew about double binds, believe you me. And that would have made you incapable of making a decision. You'd be given a shock while being given the two opposite poles of what he called a goals, problems, mass. These were actually procedures that were developed in the late 1950s and 60s. And he then dumped these huge lists. And he said it was like digging a trench. You just had to go in there day after day after day. Remember, I interviewed the first man who was held to have successfully completed the clearing course, John McMaster, the world's first real clear, 1965. And he said to me, well, I don't know why he chose me, but one day he said to me, "Right, John, you finished." And so I attested clear. And he did talk like that, by the way. It was a beautiful Durban accent. And as gay as anything you have ever met in your life. He wrote me a ferocious letter because I interviewed him and I said, it's okay to be gay. And I wrote to him and said, there's even actually a group in LA that call themselves the Gay Theatre Association. So it's fine now. It's not against the law. And I got a 7-page incensed letter explaining that he had never been homosexual in his life. I then had a conversation with Otto Roos, and he called his secretary over and said, "What did John say to me on the phone?" And it was obscene, but it was most certainly gay, about what he wanted to do with Otto's lovely member. But he was still caught up in the horrible way that homosexuals were treated for so long. I got a phone call from a guy who's a stage designer in Hollywood, a set designer in Hollywood, in the mid-90s. And this guy said, I was one of the first 10 clears. And he said 7 of us were gay. 7. And he said, we used to call ourselves the queer clears. And he said, why do you think Hubbard chose us? And I'm going, come on, go figure. People he can blackmail. It's 1965.
Interesting take on all of that. I had never heard any of that. All I knew about was John McMaster. That's fascinating.
Yeah. But what they had to do was go through these lists month after month after month after month. And
yeah, OT2 takes a long time. It's one of the longer ones.
Well, it didn't take me a long time. I think I did 2 days on it. And
well, okay, usually for us normal mortals it takes a long time.
I think they were, because in the natural clear period, they wanted to push you through anything that was solo audited, anything you did to yourself. They wanted you through as fast as possible so that you could rack up some £200 an hour stuff on OT.
That's right. And OT 1, 2, and 3, you do on yourself in a room with an e-meter. It's just you and the
Yeah.
command sheet, and you have a procedure to follow, and you follow it, and you turn in a report every day as to what you're doing, and they monitor your progress that way. OT4 and OT5 are somebody else auditing you, and that's where the big bucks come in again. I think OT1, 2, and 3 now is, as a package, is about $25,000 or something.
Wow.
But they'll charge you about $4,500 to $5,000 for a 12.5-hour chunk of auditing for OT4 and OT5.
And
so you can see the escalation of prices very, very quickly.
Yeah, and I mean, I took with Lillian Collins, who was married to the head of Collins Publishers, the biggest publisher in the world, now HarperCollins. And she said to me, I always wondered why it was that it took me so much longer to do everything than anyone else. And I think she told me she'd spent £1 million in Scientology. And
yeah, kind of funny how those people with all the money have so many more folders of auditing than the people
right,
who
though,
don't.
somehow, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The rich can't anything happen, you know.
Yeah.
So I spent 3 days on OT3. That was
on
my
OT2 or 3?
3. I spent
on
2
3.
days on OT2, 3 days on OT3, where I met Xenu and the Body Thetans and all of that stuff. Then I went and I tested OT3. Nobody had a problem with that. And then 2 days later, I went in and said, did nothing for me. You know, and I expected, I'll retread, you know, have to pay half and do it again, ethics, you know, all sorts of stuff. And the salesman, the registrar, who before he became registrar had been the senior case supervisor, United Kingdom. He'd been the top auditor in the United Kingdom just a couple of months before, but he realized he could get 2% from selling things to people, and it was a better life. And he looked at me and he said, a lot of people find that. Now, that was an immense shock.
Yes, it was. Both that he said it and that it was true.
I then go on to, you know, what you need is OT4. So I borrowed the money for OT4. 12.5 hours, I'm through OT4. All of the little junky body thetans that have attached themselves to me have been healed, and they didn't have to pay anything for it. So I'm sure it didn't do them any good, because free service, free fall. So the body thetan should have been got to pay for that, not me.
Okay, now I am very remiss here because we have skipped over Xenu, and how am I not asking you about that? What, you know, you're coming at this, you're Mr. Critical Thinking, you do see through a lot of bullshit, but you're still going along, and then you get the handwritten story from Hubbard, which I believe then, as in now, the course supervisors are there watching you like a hawk, because they know this is going to be interesting, and you read this and you look up, and what happens?
Well, I looked up, and a guy I knew had walked into the dungeon, which was this drab little place, and, you know, halfway under what they call the castle, some castle at St. Hill. I've seen real castles. And this guy walked in and he looked at me and he could see I was reading OT3 pack, and he said, it's like Colin Wilson's Mind Parasites. I'm going, whoa, because I'm reading this stuff and going, this is a bit weird. But he then quotes a novel I happen to have read. So that was quite interesting, about these little creatures that feed off your thoughts. And something about that made me believe that there might be something in this, that maybe he'd, you know, it was in fact
interesting.
It's a coincidence.
Interesting.
I don't think there's more to it. So yes, I'm introduced to Xenu and all of this stuff, and it's kind of gone off the rails. That through Dianetics, through the grade processes, I'm happy to believe in reincarnation, in past life memories, and all of that. But the body Satan stuff starts bothering me a little bit. But, you know, I talked to a guy a couple of years later, you know, after I'd left, Derek Geiler, and he, lovely guy, and he said that he was a 50s Scientologist, and he said most of us, when we saw this stuff, went, he's gone round the bend. But, I thought I'll check it on the e-meter. And it read. So I did it. And I looked at him, Derek Guy, I think. I looked at him and I said, did you ever check the e-meter? And he went, oh, no, I didn't think of doing that. And I told him, about how the meter generates about half of the reads because it's made from such cheap components. A friend of mine made one with all the most, just the jewel that they used to put the needle on cost more than all the parts for Mark V e-meter. Just the diamond they used cost more than everything. They were using germanium transistors. I don't know what they are, but apparently it's a very bad thing to do. Just the cheapest stuff. He was the e-meter repairman at St. Hill, so they just used cheap stuff. And they ran their meter with the bar recorder, and they went out to the bar while they were doing it. When they came back, there were twice as many reads on the Mark V as on what would later be called the ability meter. And they thought, oh, we've done something wrong. So the next time they didn't go to the pub, they brought their beer home and watched it, and they realized that Mark V produced half of the reads that were coming out of it. About this later on, there would be silver ceiling where all e-meters were called back in because the carbon potentiometer, the volume control on the e-meter, basically was made of carbon and was shedding carbon dust and creating what are called rock slams, for which people were being sent to the rehabilitation project force. And having seen e-meters that didn't have anybody plugged into them or any cans doing rock slams, I knew there was something wrong with them, But they're a high-precision instrument created by Volney L. Ron Hubbard. Oh, just so ridiculous.
John, come on, get your facts straight here, man.
Yeah. The Volney e-meter. Yeah, the Matheson e-meter.
That's right.
So I did it. I kind of had misgivings. I went in and said, I didn't really do anything for me. I don't have any supernatural abilities. And in the pack itself, it said that the end phenomenon of OT3 is huge affinity for everyone or something. This was one of the little things. And I hadn't seen much of that, I must say. And so he said, this guy says, oh, you need OT4, borrow the money, do OT4. A couple of days after finishing OT4, nothing reads on it, so it's finished. Needle's floating. My needle normally floats. I'm that kind of person. What can I say? And I go in and say, sorry, same again. And he says, a lot of people find that. What you need is OT5. So I borrow money, 25 hours, I think £2,500, which was, considering I'd spent years working to get 3,500 to buy the rest, and it was awful. The guy auditing me, it's a guy called Mike Austin, smelled, and he couldn't open the window to the room. Now, it's interesting that actually the windows opened onto anybody could walk past. It was on a walkway. So people were doing OT5 secret sessions, and anybody could stand outside the window and hear them. But he couldn't open the window. It was jammed. And I'm kind of going, this guy is an OT5 auditor and he can't open a window and he smells. Oh dear. So I complained because you've worked out that's the kind of girl I am. And, in a nice way. And I got Richard Rees. Richard Rees at the time was the senior case supervisor UK. He only had two people he was auditing. In the afternoon he did me, and in the morning he did Van Morrison.
Wow.
He went to London and audited Van Morrison, who dedicated two of his worst. I mean, he's done many great albums. He really has. But the 80s is a very slumped period for Van Morrison.
Yeah, exactly.
And the inarticulate speech of the heart is relatively inarticulate, actually.
Wow. Just as a point, I looked up, and 2,500 pounds in 1979 is 12,700 pounds now. Valuation in terms of inflation value.
It was 1981, if you want to get really accurate.
81. Okay, good. Okay.
But yeah, I would think something similar applies because inflation.
Yeah, 9,600 now.
£9,600.
Yeah,
Which would
just in
be
case
about,
anybody was wondering what kind of bucks are we talking about now? If you got to go off
12
and saved,
$12,000, something like that.
probably
Yeah.
all. Yeah. Oh, yeah, and then putting that into dollars. Yeah.
While I was on OT5, and Richard Rees, by the way, is when Bill Clinton said that he'd known a Scientologist when he was at Oxford, it was Richard Rees. So if anybody wants to check out, he's sadly no longer with us. I must say that he had got his training routine zero down to the point where you could have thought he was made of wood. You know, and you go into a session with somebody. Now, me, if I'm trying to help somebody, I tend to smile and be encouraging. So having somebody, I'll repeat the auditing question, you know, that he was like that all the time.
Right.
And it was unnerving. It's the way that a phlegmatic, an apathetic person, you know, they don't have emotional responses. And I'm told that before he did the rehabilitation project for us, he didn't have this problem. So, and that he was actually
that doesn't
a lovely
surprise
guy.
me. Yeah, doesn't surprise me at all.
While I was doing OT5, when I got into Scientology in Birmingham, the person who actually owned the mission was Stephanie Ryburn. But she was away trying to find out how it was that the American mission holders were making such huge amounts of money where they couldn't make anything in the UK. So she was, you know, Martin Samuels, Kingsley Wimbush, Bent Corridon, these legends who were making millions, particularly Martin Samuels with the Delphi schools and all that, before David Miscavige destroyed them all.
Parallel, by the way, just another little point of parallel is she's going off to LA to learn about this stuff. That's where I am. 1980, 1981, my parents were Pasadena mission staff under these people you're naming, Carl Barney specifically. And these people were vastly successful with Scientology. They were making hundreds of thousands of dollars a shot. The missions they were running throughout California, which are now have been all converted to churches of Scientology, Santa Barbara, San Diego, Valley, all these churches used to be missions, and they were very successful under these guys. So just another little parallel, you know, in our lives a little bit there that I thought I'd throw out there.
Yeah, and it's a story that, you know, we will be talking about in some detail soon, because I have tapes of the Mission Holders Conference from 1982, which is the gold. I didn't realize that I believe the only person in the world who has an actual tape recording of the Mission Holders Conference in 1982. But we'll talk about that elsewhere. So I hadn't met Stephanie until she and her husband Don came back to England just before I went to a few weeks before I went down to St. Hill. And when she looked at me, she looked disgusted. You know, she was an OT3. She was a Class 8 trained by Hubbard. And you just got that vibe, you know, that, and she's an OT, so you know that she's reading your thoughts. So you'll pretty soon start thinking something disgusting. You know? It's just the way it is. And she wouldn't use my name. She never smiled at me. Here she is. We've not met since. And she comes out of the OT5 waiting room, or the New Era Dianetics for OTs waiting room, as we called it then, NED for OTs. Knots. Why is solo knots not called snots? She comes out beaming at me and says, John. She actually uses my name and she's smiling at me. And she says, isn't it wonderful that Ron found something to clean up the mess that OT3 makes? She'd done OT3 15 years before under L. Ron Hubbard's supervision. And she'd spent, the reason that she was looking at me the way she was looking at me was because she'd been screwed up by OT3, which is not infrequent. It's not infrequent at all. He may not have used drugs when people were looking, but he sure as hell screwed up a lot of people's lives. So I came away from that. The next episode was having Lee Lawrence, who I'm willing to make pejorative statements about on any day of the week. I'm pretty sure he's no longer with us. He'd be about 112 if he were. He was a moneylender of the worst kind. And he was the same registrar who sold me OT4 and OT5 now wanted me to borrow £7,000 to do so. What, that's about 30,000 now, about $40,000, what have you. And they got the check, and they came round, and they spent 13 hours in my apartment trying to convince me to take this check to pay for, you know, whatever OT6 and 7 or whatever it was. And this would be at 30% interest per annum.
Holy cow, 30%.
Yeah.
Yeah,
With
thanks,
penalties.
no thanks. Oh.
Yeah, so I had 13 hours with these guys. I don't think we had anything to eat during that time. You know, it's but I showed them the door. You know, and things were, you know, I wasn't really all that happy. I still believed somehow that Hubbard had the answer. But by this time, noise is starting to be made. We're starting to hear that this terrible thing has happened in San Francisco, the Mission Holders Conference, where the wealthy mission holders have basically had their missions stolen from them. I believe Martin Samuels even had his Rolex watch stolen from him. Ben Corridan's bank account with $900,000 in is gone. His $2 million building, which I did help him get back. And Ben, if you're watching this, I'd still like you to pay the bill, mate. You know, because that wasn't really very good, was it? You know, here we are. That was 1991. Still, bless him. What can you say about mission holders? They're people who made a lot of money by getting people enslaved in Scientology.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did.
We saw David Mayo was declared suppressive, and it had been made very clear that he was the heir apparent. Hubbard had made it clear that this was the guy that was going to take over from him. And we'd had the little film with David Mayo in the sort of not really acting very well with the Homburg hat on and the suit. And, you know, they're kind of somehow meant to be a Bugsy Malone gangster, I think, with the great music.
It was I think that film was called The Secret of Flag Results. Yeah. And he was acting like the senior tech guy or the senior case supervisor guy. And the movie, I was only told about it years later. I never saw it because it was out of commission by the time I came into Scientology formally in 1985, where I start really taking classes and stuff. Mayo's name was already mud at that point, and all the things connected with him had been stripped or taken out or taken away, and that film was history. And so then people were talking derogatorily about it, but at the time that it came out, it was this amazing film, and isn't David Mayo such a wonderful guy, you know, because he was kind of the hero of the piece.
Oh, absolutely. And Hubbard had put in there, it's the only one of the tech films I ever saw. You know,
oh, that's funny.
None of the others ever seemed to be released. I interviewed lots of people who'd worked on them. Yeah, but they were all still around at that time.
Wow. But
yes, in it, he does this thing. This now, children, if this is lost, you'll know what happened. About the SPs and how the suppressives and how they'll take things over. So I did find it funny when we suddenly get this suppressive person declare on Mayo, followed by the story of a squirrel, in which we are told L. Ron Hubbard has said David Mayo was the bird dog in the control room. So as my mother, who I said was involved for 8 years in Scientology, she said, well, how is it that Ron Hubbard could work with this guy for 25 years and not notice he was a suppressive?
Your mother was smarter than me. I never thought to ask that question when all that was going down.
It's a matter of which way your attention is pointed. That the way that we're conned by magicians and conjurers is by our attention being, well, look at my hand over here while I'm picking your pocket with the other one. You know, we were, you know, we weren't looking. We didn't know how to look, and we're gradually learning how as we get older. So that's sort of coming down, and Jeannie Hansen arrived in East Grinstead saying that bad things were happening, and John Ziegel started sending out tapes. I think there were 4 of them in the end. These little cassette tapes, they were all over the place with people telling their stories. I got L. Ron Hubbard Jr. Nibs to make one, which was great and went all over the place. That's my contribution.
In case anybody out there is wondering how you mass distribute information as a private citizen back in the day before the internet and YouTube existed, yeah, that's how you did it. You made tapes.
Little cassette tapes, which you'd send out all over the place. Now, I still have all of mine, and that's why I still have the Mission Holders Conference. And Tony Ortega, I think, told me he'd been looking for it for 3 years. He'd heard there was
you have gold. You and I are definitely talking about that tape after the show. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's got the David Miscavige section on it, which was never released in the transcript, where he talks about the original Founders Bulletin, which is one of my favorites, which came out in 1982, red on white, just like a Hubbard issue, all the heading, everything perfect like a Hubbard issue. And it basically says, I'm the original L. Ron Hubbard. I was driven out of the body by the evil guy you've been following. Great. And
again, news to me, man. I can't wait to get this stuff. I love this little stuff. This is awesome.
It's what keeps this work endlessly fascinating.
Exactly. Isn't it? Isn't it?
There's another crazy story.
Every time you think, every time. I have never found, in all the years of my life, and I guess I get to say there's quite a few of them at this point, I've never found a statement that just keeps on giving like this one, which is Scientology is always worse than you think. I've never found that to be like, it always just keeps proving itself as I do this, and it's been years now, and I still can't find a bottom, So
I was talking with Jim Beverly when we first started conspiring to do the Getting Clear seminar, the 5-day seminar in Toronto. He said to me, he's written 18 books or something now. He said that he really this is sort of 2014. He really wanted to write that book about Scientology because it was so much more interesting than anything else. He's written about the Moonies, the Jehovah's Witnesses, all sorts of Christian things, but nothing has the kind of pure amount of stories. This astonishing human being, L. Ron Hubbard, this little fat kid with spots that nobody liked, that had no friends, that was terrified of horses, according to a guy who was at school with him when he was 15, a guy called, I think, Andrew Saunders, something like that, who Russell Miller interviewed, and yet was breaking broncos while in the womb or what have you. Yes, and he goes to China on a couple of little holidays with his family, and he therefore is studied with gurus in the western hills of China. The only trouble with China is there are too many chinks there. His contemporaneous handwritten journal says, and the lamas had voices like bullfrogs. That's the only statement in the diaries, which of course Scientology put into a court case thinking they would never go public. And on a day when the seal was lifted, I was given a copy. So that's my gift to the world, the teenage diaries of L. Ron Hubbard. They smell of all the baths they didn't take. That was his comment about Chinese people.
Wow.
And he did use the word dukes throughout to talk about foreigners. Whatever.
Yeah, Hubbard wasn't shy about his casual racism, that's for sure.
No, he was sexist, he was racist, anything you want. Remember the one in South Africa about Bantus that if you want to pull an overt crime from a Bantu, then it would be not stealing something.
That's right. He had a horrible opinion of people down there.
Yeah, and he complains when people say that South Africa was a police state, and he developed the technique of using the e-meter on a person by strapping the electrodes under their arms or putting plates on their feet so that you can interrogate them, which of course later led to people being executed in Morocco when the King of Morocco used the techniques, which John McClane talked about at Toronto, I think for the only time ever. He talked about why he'd left the SEAL, because he could see that having persuaded the King of Morocco to use an e-meter to security check his intelligence people, some of them would be killed, and they were. You know, the benefits of Scientology. Did L. Ron Hubbard use drugs? Does that really matter? Did L. Ron Hubbard screw people up? Yes, he did. Was he a savage, angry narcissist? Yes, he was. You know, these things matter. I saw the story of a squirrel about David Mayo. I couldn't believe that Ron Hubbard had written the statements attributed to him, bird dog in the control room, and things like that. I later discovered he had. That he was very much still in control, certainly through 1983, when the dementia, I think, started to take him away completely for periods of time, from what I've been able to establish from people.
I agree with you on that from everything I've read.
Yeah. And Miscavige was just somebody who did what he was told. He had no authority, he had no power of any kind, but he was the communication line to Pat Broker, who was the communication line to Hubbard. So I started looking at this stuff, and I remember I got very sick. September 83, early September, I was physically bedridden. I think it's the last time I've ever been bedridden with any condition. It was a doctor believed at the time that I had meningitis. My symptoms were so severe and came out in the middle of the night. And it wasn't. It was basically this, it had suddenly hit me that I belonged to an organization which was exactly the opposite of what I believed. That I still believed that Hubbard was good, but I believed he was gone. And it became necessary. So what I did was I wrote a little list of questions, each of which had a policy letter reference attached to it, which basically, if you looked at them, showed that the current management, I didn't realize it was Hubbard, were actually violating policy very severely. I gave this, in fact, to the doctor who came out in the middle of the night to see me because she was a Scientologist, and she reported me to ethics, which was 9 years, I think there may have been 3 ethics checks or knowledge reports in 9 years in the stacks of commendations in my ethics folder. I never had a PTS rundown. I'd never been any negative suggestion. Certainly.
Oh, let me ask you real fast, actually. Let's address this for a second, because this speaks also to the conversation I had with my mom about the 70s and 80s Scientology versus what it's become. Were you ever, I mean, other than that 3.5-hour sec check you got, was there ever any talk about masturbation or controlling your sex life in any way during that period? Right, no. Right. And that was pretty common and universal at the lower levels, right? Because all that crazy, heavy ethics stuff hadn't really hit yet. That was Hubbard, but it was also Miscavige, you know, and you're talking about the time when that transition started happening.
Yeah, I mean, there are variant periods, as you know. Mm-hmm. When Hubbard put to sea in 1967, 68 with the Sea Project, the original 19 people, you can see, if you look at the shrinking world of L. Ron Hubbard, you can see the state that the Sea organization are in, and it's pretty awful. You know, you can see.
Oh, no doubt. Yeah. Oh, no doubt. The Sea Org guys, let's be clear, and in case I was unclear just now, the highest levels of Scientology have always been screwed. Anywhere near L. Ron Hubbard's inner circle, and you were in danger almost all the time because of Hubbard's vindictiveness, if nothing else. And he was a vindictive dude. I mean, that guy was ruthless. If you crossed him,
and he didn't share drugs with people either.
Yeah, yeah. He was just a bad guy. So being close to him was always dangerous. Being in the Sea Org was absolutely insane from day one. The lower levels of Scientology, the missions, the orgs, that had not yet filtered down. The management structure that we now see, that was built in the 70s and again mainly reinforced through the 80s. So this was all kind of coming into you know, as far as the shit rolling downhill, It took a few years for it to start rolling down, and this is what we're talking about now.
Well, I came in just after what was called the Battle of Britain, which was in the summer of '74, when about half of the UK public decided to leave because Alex Sibursky, also known as Berserksky, had come down, put up a marquee at St. Hill, got everybody in and said, you can't leave until you've written a postulate check, a check that you will payment. And I did trace that story. He was briefed by Diana Hubbard to do this, and she was briefed by Ron Hubbard to do it.
Exactly.
You have cutouts if you're a mafia don or any kind of don. The don who's running America at the moment, but we won't get into that. So I like to think of him as though the Don, not the Donald. You can cut that bit out if you value your life. So they had lost a huge amount of the membership, and so they're actually really nice through the 70s. And it's only when Hubbard realizes that the Guardian's office are going to prison, including his wife. His wife signs the stipulation of evidence, 217, 219 pages, the longest confession I've ever read in my life, so that he will not be indicted. He then refuses to ever speak to her or communicate with her again. That's her reward for going to prison on his behalf. And he becomes utterly paranoid that they're going to catch him. And so the paranoia brings up a new system, which is basically that now the messengers, the teenagers who are with him, they're the people he trusts. He doesn't trust anybody else. And he's got to get rid of the Guardian's office. And that's where Miscavige takes power. And the mission holders then are thought to be conspiring with the Guardian's office because they've had this meeting where the Guardian's office people have admitted they've been spying on them on Hubbard's behalf. And so they're all matey. And so Hubbard is frightened that the Guardian's office and the mission holders will splinter, which is, of course, what he made happen.
Exactly.
All the big mission holders were either thrown out, or people like Sarge Gabodi in Palo Alto or Bank Corridor in Riverside set up independent groups. And as Jesse Prince said at Toronto, we were the independents. I was briefly an independent for a few months there. We were actually getting more people up the bridge with, in East Grinstead, I think we had 7 people who were involved with they had 180 at St. Hill, and they were getting less people trained and less auditing hours than we were because of this paranoid espionage structure, which is, the flag rep watches the L. Ron Hubbard communicator is watched by the assistant guardian. They're all reporting to make sure that nobody takes any of the money out, which, of course, is funny because when Jesse Prince did his final confession on David Miscavige, which he does talk about at Toronto for anybody who's willing to pay the $3 to watch it, you mean, what can I say? Jesse talks about doing this confessional on Miscavige where Miscavige is crying when he comes into the room. Hubbard has ordered a confessional, and what comes out, according to Jesse, is that Miscavige admits that he and Pat Broker have been taking money from Hubbard's private account and going whoring and gambling in Las Vegas with her. Then Pat Broker stops the report from getting to Hubbard. So,
bing, and that's how it worked.
With the guy in charge being a guy who is probably suffering from a mental condition of some sort, one might say. But anyway, yes. Returning to the last bit of my exit, I was, an ethics report was made that I'd done this thing. I then was visited by a man called Bevan Priest, and he somehow managed to get past my wife into the bedroom where I was asleep, because, as I say, I sleep till noon normally. And I woke up with this guy saluting me, saying, would I host a meeting with Captain Bill Robertson at the Crown Hotel in 3 days' time, because John Mace had gone back to Australia and he'd organised it, and Bevan didn't really know what he was doing. And would I do it, please, sir? And so I went, yeah, okay. And that's a good point, because that's where I left, October 1983. And that meeting, you can still find it online, bits of it, with Captain Bill shouting at people. It was brilliant. But that's worthy of a whole episode of it on its own. In fact, Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky was originally a book called The Scientology War, and it was about Captain Bill. It was about the independence and how we left, and Collins wanted to publish it. The guy who wanted to publish it fought for 3 months with the editorial committee to try and get it published, because he said it was obvious from reading it that I was still brainwashed.
Awesome. Wow.
So we will be publishing that book later.
I would love to see that, just to get the headspace, you know.
It became just part of a chapter in the end, the whole book, because I realized I got to explain to the non-Scientologist reader quite a lot of things as to why the Miscavians had invaded the planet in Switzerland and were going to take the planet over by selling gold in 1986, and we'd all got to watch out, which Captain Bill, when he wasn't dressed up as a nightclub singer in a sparkly gown, singing songs to Ron. And these are other stories. These are other stories which we'll get.
Yeah, we're gonna definitely get there, because it's crazy stuff. I mean, like you said, every time you think you've seen bottom, there's something else to talk about with this stuff, and it really is impressively horrible.
Well, and I really should be sick and tired of it, you know, because this is now what 45 years of my life, and it lures you back, you know.
Exactly.
What can I say?
They pull you back in. Okay, folks, here's what we're going to do. John's story, of course, is action-packed, and there is a ton of stuff here, and we have not actually even got halfway through it. And we've gotten to the point now where Jon officially has left Scientology. And so what we're going to do is we're going to split this up into a couple parts. And so we're going to do part 2 in a couple weeks, or, when we get that done and get it to you guys. We're not going to make you wait for a long time. But yeah, we want to get this done, and we want to have the time to give it justice, right? I mean, it took me, 8 hours to tell my whole personal story. I want to give Jon the justice of telling his whole story too. So we're going to wrap up right now. But if you have any questions, comments, or feedback about this episode so far, be sure to leave it in the comment section at YouTube or at sensiblyspeaking.com, and I will be posting this, and Jon will see it, and perhaps he will comment on some of your questions on YouTube after we post this thing, and we will get on with the rest of this fascinating story and see about getting it all out to you. So
I'm happy to if people have questions, I'm happy to do a piece on my own channel to answer whatever questions they have, as long as they're not obviously too personal. But I can't tell you how big L. Ron Hubbard's member was, or anything like that.
Excellent. Well, let's put it out here then. How do people reach you directly, or how do people reach out to you with questions?
Well, I have a YouTube channel, Jon Atack Family and Friends, and pretty much if somebody comes into the comment section there, I presume this piece will go on your channel, and if you sort of sort out any questions that people have, pass them over to me, and I will seek to answer them. I've just had a friend actually send in some questions which I have answered, which we'll be putting up in the next week or two. So I think it's a good way to go, because satisfying people's curiosity. There always are those other little questions, and I'm very happy to speak to that.
Excellent. Good. Okay, folks. And once again, of course, as Jon's reminding us, he has his own YouTube channel. So please do go over there and hit that subscribe button, because you will not be disappointed. Jon's content is interesting, informative, and educational, and something that you guys should be checking out. So that all being said, thanks for coming around. I'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.